Vadim Ershov. For 3 years in the early 1990s, a man in the Siberian city of Krasnoyarsk kept a careful record of his own crimes. It was laid out like a bookkeeper's ledger, 7 columns wide, a fresh row for every attack, noting the number, the season, the weapon, the kind of injury, the location, and the person he had chosen. He returned to the scenes afterward, and he read the local papers to follow what the police knew. By the time a woman with a fire extinguisher finally stopped him in a stairwell, that ledger held far more entries than anyone had imagined a single man could be responsible for. Vadim Ershov was born on February 15, 1973, in a small village in Kirov Oblast, and raised in the Krasnoyarsk region of Russia. To the people around him in those years, he seemed unremarkable, a quiet young man who drew little attention. What they could not see was a compulsion that state psychiatric experts would later describe as a total arrest of his development, joined to a cruelty of the sadistic kind. That contrast, an ordinary surface stretched over something monstrous, is exactly what let him operate for so long. Between 1992 and 1995, Ershov committed more than 70 crimes in and around the city, including roughly 40 robberies and 8 attacks that were meant to end lives but did not. 19 of those crimes did. His victims were almost entirely women, most subjected to sexual violence before their lives were taken. The first was a catering worker, 42 years old, on June 28, 1992. One of the people he later attacked was a police officer. He returned again and again to the places where he had struck, studied how the investigation was reported, and after each act, he opened his table and added another line. Put plainly, he was keeping score. The city of Krasnoyarsk lived under that shadow for 3 years without a name to attach to it. Women changed how they moved through their own neighborhoods. Rumors outran the facts, and the man responsible walked among them the entire time, reading the same newspapers they did, following the fear he had created as though it were a story about someone else. He was not brought down by brilliant detective work. In late October of 1995, he attacked a young girl in a stairwell, trying to tear a gold chain from her neck. She screamed. Relatives came running, and a woman from the building struck him hard enough with a fire extinguisher to knock him unconscious. When officers searched him and his belongings, his own record did the rest of the work for them, laying out the pattern he had spent years documenting himself. How do you measure a man who filed his crimes like paperwork? The case against Ershov ran to 43 volumes. In June of 1998, a military court in Siberia convicted him on every count. As the verdict was read aloud, he fainted in the courtroom. His lawyer asked the court for mercy, but Ershov offered none for himself, telling the court that he had forfeited the right to live. He was sentenced to death by shooting. On January 28, 1999, the military collegium of the Supreme Court upheld the sentence. Then Russia's moratorium on capital punishment intervened, and the death sentence was commuted to life. Experts at the Serbsky Institute had found an anomaly of sadistic attraction at the root of his behavior, yet the court ruled that he was legally sane and therefore fully responsible for all of it. It is worth noting that some outlets reported 16 deaths in his case, but the figure tied to the court record, and the more careful accounts, is 19. Ershov belonged to a specific generation of Russian offenders, the men condemned to death in the 1990s whose executions never came. When the country suspended capital punishment in the years that followed, an entire cohort of the condemned had their sentences quietly converted to life. And it is that cohort, the former occupants of death row, who filled the cells of Black Dolphin when it opened as a life colony in the year 2000. Ershoff was among the earliest of them. The investigators who studied his ledger were struck less by its contents than by its order, by the sense that he treated each attack not as a loss of control, but as an entry to be recorded and filed. He had begun with a single act in the summer of 1992, and over 3 years had settled into a grim routine, growing bolder as the city's fear of him grew. By the time he was stopped, he had left a trail across dozens of separate crimes, and the calm with which he had catalogued them all was, to the people who read that notebook, the hardest part of the whole case to sit with. Ershoff was sent to the special regime colony in the town of Soliletsk, known as Black Dolphin, near the border with Kazakhstan, and this is the place at the center of every story that follows. It takes its name from a small statue of a dolphin, painted black, that sits in a fountain at the administrative entrance, positioned so that the men who give the prison its reputation will never once lay eyes on it. Inside, the regime is built to disorient. New arrivals are blindfolded when they are moved, so they cannot map the building. Cells run to roughly 4.5 square meters, a cage set inside another cage, with steel bars separating a prisoner from both the door and the window. The lights never go off. Guards check each cell every 15 minutes, and every time a door opens, the men inside must face the wall and announce themselves. In its entire history as a colony for life prisoners, not one man has ever walked back out. As of today, Vadim Ershoff is one of them. Ershoff did his work out in the open, on the streets of a Siberian city, and hid it only in a notebook. The man whose story comes next managed something stranger. He committed much of his from behind the very walls that were supposed to be holding him. Sergei Shipilov. Men who commit crimes like this usually stay in the shadows, careful never to be seen. Sergei Shipilov was the opposite. He carried out much of his work while he was already a convicted prisoner, driving a truck out through the colony gates twice a week with the guards' full permission, and coming back before anyone thought to ask where he had been. Shipilov was born in 1959 in Arkhangelsk, in Russia's far north. He was married, a father of 3, and had trained as a driving instructor at a vocational school. He was, in other words, a man with an ordinary life and an ordinary trade. And that ordinariness is part of what made him so difficult to see coming. He was first sent to prison for a sexual offense. Within 6 months, his good behavior earned him a privileged status inside the colony near the town of Velsk, the right to move outside the walls without an escort. Twice a week, he drove a sewage truck along a route that took him past bus stops and into the surrounding forest. He used those trips to approach women, and the women he approached did not come back. He buried them along his route, often near the dump where that route ended. Later, he told investigators he had felt a strange pity for the youngest of them, and had turned instead to women in middle age, a distinction he seemed to think spoke well of him. He compared himself, without shame, to Andrei Chikatilo. You would think someone would have noticed a pattern. For a long time, no one did. How does a convicted prisoner end up with the freedom to do such a thing? On October 25, 2000, the Arkhangelsk Regional Court sentenced Shipilov to life and stripped him of every privilege he had abused. A newspaper covering the verdict wrote that the maniac from Velsk would die on the fire island, its name for Black Dolphin. His original conviction covered 12 deaths, though some accounts cite 14. He was sent to the colony, and there the story could have ended. It did not. From inside prison, his true total kept climbing. In May of 2016, he received additional years for 2 robbery-related deaths from the 1990s. Then, in late June of 2026, A court in Arkhangelsk convicted him of 3 more, one dating back to 1989 and 2 others from the middle of that decade. Prosecutors described those crimes in cold, specific terms. The court handed down another 9 years and 11 months, and according to reporting from that summer, the regional prosecutor's office and the court now placed 17 lives on his account. In a jailhouse interview years earlier, Shipilov had introduced himself to a reporter as the Arkhangelsk Chikatilo. He argued that a man in the grip of this thing does not control himself, that he acts and cannot stop, as though the choice were never his to make. As of today, he remains at Black Dolphin, and given how his confessions keep surfacing, his final count may still not be settled. Every so often he reappears in a courtroom for another cold case, adds another sentence he can never finish serving, and returns to his cell. The privilege that made his crimes possible had a name inside the Russian prison system, a trusted status granted to inmates deemed reliable enough to work beyond the fence without a guard at their shoulder. Shipilov had earned it in half a year, and he used it through much of the time he was supposed to be paying for his first offense. That is the detail that has kept his case in the news for a quarter of a century. Every few years, another set of remains is tied back to those unescorted drives. Another cold case closes, and the man at the center of it is brought back before a court to be sentenced again for something he did decades ago. Whether his talk of a compulsion beyond his control was an explanation or an excuse, the courts have never treated it as either. To them, he is simply a man who kept taking lives after the state believed it had already stopped him, and who may not be finished confessing even now. For the families in the Velsk area, the arithmetic has never stopped shifting. A relative who vanished in the 80s or 90s, long grieved and long unexplained, becomes a line in a new indictment, and a courtroom reopens a wound that had barely closed. Each of Shipilov's late confessions brings a measure of grim clarity to one family and reminds a dozen others how many of their own questions remain unanswered. Shipilov's true tally kept rising long after the door had closed behind him. He was not the only man inside that prison whose crimes refused to stay buried. Kagashbek Orenbayev. Some killers are caught, convicted, and that is where their story ends. Kagashbek Orenbayev was caught, convicted, and sent to the harshest prison in Russia, and only then did the full scale of what he had done begin to surface, one confession at a time, until a single life sentence was no longer enough to hold it. Orenbayev was born on July 14, 1962, in what was then the Kyrgyz Republic of the Soviet Union. He studied in Minsk, drifted to the Altai region, and finally settled in Buryatia, in the country's east. Along the way, he left behind a pattern that stretched across more than 2 decades and several regions, hidden in plain sight behind casual jobs and shared bottles of alcohol. His method rarely changed. He would strike up a brief acquaintance, share a drink, make an advance, and when he was refused, take the person's life. What came afterward is the part that is hard to speak about. He was described in reporting as a necrophile, and by several outlets, a cannibal. There had been a survivor once, a young seamstress he attacked in Barnaul in 1988, who lived to describe him. In his final case in September of 2012, he took the life of a woman in her 50s while doing renovation work at her home, then committed acts upon her body of the most extreme kind. He was traced and arrested through a hotel receipt that carried his own name. His confirmed total stands at 7 women and girls, ranging in age from 17 to 76, though at least one long-form account puts the figure at 8. Experts found him sane, but noted pronounced psychopathic traits of an excitable type, marked by sadistic behavior. And somehow, it gets worse. Why would a man serving life keep volunteering evidence against himself? On December 4, 2013, the Supreme Court of Buryatia convicted him of taking 2 or more lives, along with related charges, and sentenced him to life. He was sent to Black Dolphin. From inside, he began confessing to cases that had gone cold for decades. In 2022, he was convicted of the death of an elderly woman in Barnaul from 1991. In 2023, of a young girl in the same city, taken years before that. A separate case from 1992 brought him 9.5 more years, and in March of 2025, a Buryatia court added 13 years for yet another death. He now holds 2 life sentences stacked one atop the other, which changes nothing about his confinement, but produces a fresh courtroom appearance each time. Investigators suspect that is precisely the point, that he confesses in part to be moved temporarily into softer pretrial detention. From prison, he has reportedly taken up writing, filling pages with memoirs and manuscripts in which he holds forth on others as though he were the one entitled to judge. The one person who lived to describe him had crossed his path years before the crimes that finally caught up with him, a young woman in Barnaul who survived an attack while he was still refining the pattern he would use for decades. Her account sat in a file for a long time before it meant anything. When Orenbaev was at last identified, it was not through her but through that careless hotel receipt, a single piece of paper that placed him where a body had been found. From prison, he has cast himself as a kind of moral authority, filling notebooks with his views and, by several accounts, writing at length against abortion while comparing the women who choose it to killers like himself. It is the same inversion that runs through so many of these cases. The man responsible for the worst of it appointing himself the judge of everyone else. The victims he is known to have taken spanned an extraordinary range, from a girl of 17 to a woman of 76, united by nothing except the misfortune of having shared a drink or a doorway with him. Across more than 2 decades, he moved between regions, from the Altai to Buryatia, leaving behind cases that would not be connected to one another until he chose, from prison, to connect them himself. As of today, Kagashbek Orenbaev remains at Black Dolphin, still generating headlines and court dates from inside a cell he will never leave. Orenbaev had been taking lives since before some of Black Dolphin's inmates were even born. The youngest man ever sent there arrived by an entirely different road, and in a fraction of the time. Ilnaz Galyaviev, the youngest person ever sent to Russia's harshest prison for the rest of his natural life, was 21 years old when the gates closed behind him. He had no criminal record. A few years earlier, he had walked across a stage at his own school graduation, an unremarkable student in an unremarkable class. Then, one morning in the spring of 2021, he came back. Ilnaz Galyaviev was born on September 11, 2001, in Kazan, the capital of Russia's Tatarstan region. He had graduated from that same city gymnasium in 2017 and had recently been expelled from a local college after missing an exam. There were no arrests behind him, no violent history on paper. What there was, investigators would learn, was a private descent into contempt for the people around him, one he had nursed in silence. On the morning of May 11, 2021, he returned to his former school, where more than 700 students and 70 staff were present that day. He had legally purchased a hunting shotgun and had built an explosive device at home, testing it several times beforehand. What followed left 9 people dead, 7 of them students and 2 of them teachers, and dozens more injured. Before he set out, he had posted a message online announcing his intent and declaring, in effect, that he considered himself something above other people. To investigators, he later spoke of himself as a god and of a monster inside him. A subculture built around past school attacks had helped shape how he thought. Here, the numbers require care, because different sources count different things. One tally records 23 people injured. Another, measuring the legally recognized harm, puts it at well over 100. And in the criminal case itself, 667 people were formally recognized as victims. That is not a typo. 667 people were recognized as victims of a single morning. What do you do with someone the law has no larger punishment left to give? The legal process was long and closely watched. An initial psychiatric examination reportedly found him not responsible, but that finding was overturned, and a second examination, which accounted for the online subculture that had influenced him, concluded that he was sane. His trial opened on November 9, 2022, at the Supreme Court of Tatarstan. On April 13, 2023, the presiding judge sentenced him to life in a special regime colony, along with a fine of 200,000 rubles and partial civil damages, against victims' claims that totaled roughly 121 million rubles. In his final statement, Galyavyev said he had never been and never considered himself a god, and asked the victims for forgiveness, acknowledging that no words and no money would bring back the dead or make the injured whole. One father who had lost his son told the court that such a person, such a creature, should not be allowed to live. The prosecutor called the life sentence a just decision. On August 7, 2023, an appellate court in Nizhny Novgorod upheld it. He had prepared for that morning with a patience that unsettled investigators as much as the attack itself. He had tested his device 4 separate times to be sure it would work, and he had announced online in advance the kind of harm he intended to cause and his intention not to survive it. He did survive, and that left the Russian courts with a question the country had rarely faced: what to do with a very young man who had done something for which no ordinary sentence seemed to fit. The case drew in hundreds of families, thousands of pages of testimony, and a level of public attention that turned every hearing into a national event. 2 separate examinations were needed before the court was satisfied it could hold him responsible at all. The first reportedly finding him unfit, the second reversing that once his fixation on earlier attacks was taken into account. On September 15, 2023, Galyavyev was delivered to Black Dolphin. At 21, he became the prison's youngest inmate and the youngest person in Russia serving a life term, taking his place among men who had been committing crimes since before he was born. As of today, he remains there. In early 2025, bailiffs began the slow work of collecting some 23 million rubles from him toward the victim's claims. Money that everyone involved understands will never be enough, and never the point. Sending a man that young to a life colony carried a weight the court seemed to feel. He would grow old there, if he grew old at all, surrounded by men who had been committing crimes before he was born, in a place built so that a sentence of life would mean exactly that and nothing less. Whatever had driven him on that spring morning, the law had reached for the heaviest answer it possessed, and then found there was nothing heavier to give. Galyavyev's attack unfolded in a matter of minutes, in front of an entire school. The final man in this stretch of the story worked far more quietly, over years, and did most of his where almost no one believed such things could happen at all. Alexander Maslik. Alexander Maslik took 5 lives over the span of 7 years. What set him apart was never the number. It was the setting. 4 of those 5 happened after he was already locked up, inside the walls that were built to contain men exactly like him. Maslik was born in 1971 in the town of Aleisk in the Altai region, the only child of parents who drank. He was taken from his family as a boy and placed in a boarding school for troubled youth, where he suffered abuse. That childhood would later sit at the very center of his trial, when some of the people deciding his fate reportedly wept at his account of it. His first offense, at around 18, was a robbery that turned fatal. From there, the pattern moved inward, into custody itself. In one colony, he took the life of a cellmate. In a detention center in Barnaul, he took the life of another inmate, one who had been convicted of crimes against a child and afterward committed acts of cannibalism upon the body. He took another life behind bars as well. Throughout, he framed himself in almost righteous terms, casting himself as a kind of forest orderly, clearing away those he judged to be the worst among men, as if the act itself were a service he was performing. Between 1989 and 1996, his total reached 5, though some accounts place it at 4 and others as high as 6, and even Maslik's own descriptions of what he consumed shifted from one telling to the next. What kind of place produces a man who is more dangerous inside a cell than out of one? In December of 1996, a jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to death. A co-defendant received 15 years. Under the 1997 moratorium on capital punishment, Maslik's sentence was commuted to life, and in the year 2000, he was transferred to Black Dolphin. There, the man who had been so lethal in confinement became, by his own account, a broken one. He suffered from tuberculosis and kidney disease, and in 2 televised interviews he complained of the toll the regime took on him. The rule that forbids inmates from lying or sitting on the bunk through the long hours of the day. The exhaustion, the steady collapse of his health inside a body that no longer had the strength to bear it. There was a logic Maslik clung to, and he repeated it whenever anyone would listen. He was not a killer, in his own telling, but a cleaner, removing from the world the men he had decided were beyond redemption. It is a justification that has surfaced in more than one cell at Black Dolphin. The killer who imagines himself an instrument of justice rather than its opposite, and it rarely survives contact with the facts. 4 of the 5 lives he took were taken from men who were already imprisoned, already stripped of whatever threat the free world had imagined they posed. Whatever he told himself, the pattern was not one of judgment, but of appetite. And in the end, the institutions that had shaped him from childhood, the boarding school, the colonies, the courts, delivered him to the one place designed to make certain that appetite would never find another victim. Alexander Maslik did not leave Black Dolphin alive. He died inside the prison in 2015 at around 44 years old. The exact circumstances of his passing were never made public, which is its own kind of ending for a man who spent his life inside institutions that preferred not to explain themselves. He is the only man in this account who is no longer alive, and his death closed a life spent almost entirely inside institutions of one kind or another, from the boarding school of his childhood to the death row of his 20s, to the life colony of his final years. He had spent so long behind walls that the free world had become, for him, the brief and distant exception rather than the rule. The system that raised him also outlasted him. Maslik came from the very bottom of society, discarded as a child and swallowed whole by the system that finally consumed him. Not every man inside Black Dolphin arrived from the margins. One of them arrived from the very top. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, said Amirov. For 15 years, he ran one of the largest cities in Russia's Caucasus, twice honored as the finest mayor in the country, governing from a wheelchair after surviving one attempt on his life after another. What almost no one outside Dagestan understood at the time was that the same man had spent years ordering attempts on the lives of others. When the arrest finally came, it came by helicopter. Sedamirov was born on March 5, 1954, in a village in central Dagestan, trained as an economist, and became mayor of the city of Makhachkala in 1998. He held the post until 2013, a permanent fixture of the region's politics, who had survived roughly 15 assassination attempts, one of which left him using a wheelchair for the rest of his life. To much of the public, he was a survivor and a strongman who had outlasted everyone who came for him. To investigators, he sat at the center of a network that treated violence as an ordinary instrument of power. The charges against him were organizing contract killings and terrorism. His group was found responsible for the death of Arsen Gadzhibekov, the acting head of a district investigative office in Makhachkala, whose life was taken in a shooting on December 14, 2011, after he had defied Amirov and seized administration documents. Prosecutors said the order came straight from Amirov, angered by the investigators' diligence. The same network was tied to a rocket attack on a shopping and entertainment center in the city of Kaspiysk in April of 2011, carried out with a flamethrower-style weapon that caused heavy damage and, by sheer luck, took no lives. And there was a plot to bring down the aircraft of a political rival using a portable surface-to-air missile bought for roughly $150,000. How do you hold to account a man powerful enough to order deaths and never once be in the room? Amirov was arrested on June 1, 2013, in an operation backed by a helicopter. He tried to negotiate, then attempted to take his own life. In July of 2014, a military court sentenced him to 10 years over the missile plot, and his nephew, tied to the same case, received 8.5. Then, on August 27, 2015, the same court sentenced him to life for terrorism and for organizing the death of the investigator, with his nephew receiving 18 years. On March 24, 2016, the Supreme Court upheld the life sentence. The presiding judge stated that Amirov's guilt had been proven and that the court had settled on life imprisonment. A spokesman for the investigative committee said that Amirov, displeased with the investigators' active work, had ordered his death through a gang. The victim's brother testified that Amirov had phoned him demanding the return of the seized documents and had threatened to destroy him. What made Amirov's case remarkable was not a single act, but the sheer breadth of what prosecutors laid at his feet. There was the investigator, targeted for refusing to back down. There was the attack on the shopping center, launched with a weapon designed for the battlefield. There was the missile, bought abroad for a small fortune and meant to bring a rival's aircraft out of the sky. For years, none of it had touched him, insulated as he was by his office, his allies, and the distance he kept between himself and the men who carried out his orders. The operation that finally reached him required a helicopter and a show of force usually reserved for a war zone, and even then he tried first to bargain his way out and then to end things on his own terms. The courts allowed him neither. There is one more chapter that sets Amirov apart from every other man in this story. In 2017, the European Court of Human Rights ruled against Russia over the conditions of his confinement, finding that the material conditions and the medical care given to a wheelchair-using prisoner fell below the standard of human dignity, and awarding him a modest sum in damages and costs. As of today, Said Amirov remains at Black Dolphin, the former mayor among the killers, serving a life term from which there is no release, his wheelchair rolling the same corridors as the men whose crimes he once seemed a world away from. That ruling was a rare thing, an international court siding on a narrow point of dignity, with a man convicted of orchestrating deaths. It did not touch his sentence or question his guilt. It spoke only to the conditions in which a paralyzed man was being held, and it stands as a reminder that even a place built to be merciless is meant, in theory, to operate within limits. Whether those limits changed anything for him in practice is another question, and one the prison has never been in the habit of answering. Amirov never had to be present when his orders were carried out. Distance was his protection. The man whose story comes next was always present, because there was never anyone else. Vladimir Nikolaev. A drunken punch that turned fatal, a body carried home, and a decision that turned an accidental death into something out of a nightmare. Vladimir Nikolaev is remembered as one of Russia's most infamous cannibals, though the number of lives he took was only 2. What made his case unforgettable was never the count. It was what he did afterward, and who he fed. Vladimir Nikolaev was born on March 16, 1959, in Novocheboksarsk, a small industrial city in the Chuvash Republic. He is sometimes mislabeled as the Novocherkassk cannibal, but the record places him firmly in Novocheboksarsk. The child of parents who drank, he spent much of his life in and out of prison for theft and robbery, first jailed at around the age of 20. By the middle of the 90s, he was an unremarkable repeat offender in a provincial town, the sort of man the system had long since stopped watching closely. The first death, in 1996, he described as an accident, a drunken blow that ended a drinking companion's life. Not grasping at first that the man had died, he carried the body home. Then he made the choice that would define him, dismembering the body and consuming part of it, and passing some of the flesh to an acquaintance while claiming it was antelope meat. That family, knowing nothing, cooked and ate dumplings made from it. The second death, the following year, was deliberate, done for the meat itself, part of which he sold at a market and traded for alcohol. He was undone when the neighbors who had received the disguised meat grew suspicious of it and took it to the police, who searched his home and found human remains stored there, in his refrigerator and on his balcony. How does a town fail to notice something like this happening in one of its own apartments? In 1997, the Supreme Court of the Chuvash Republic sentenced Nikolaev to death. 2 years later, under the same moratorium that spared so many of Black Dolphin's inmates, his sentence was commuted to life, and he was sent to the colony in Sol-Iletsk. His prison file reduced him to a few cold lines: prone to escape and to attack, a cannibal, a chronic alcoholic, coarse and unbalanced. In televised interviews from inside, he spoke about what he had done with an unsettling calm, describing the taste in a way he said was hard to put into words. He also argued that his punishment was too harsh, insisting that because his first death had not been planned, a term of 20 to 25 years would have been fairer than a life sentence. He said he intended to file for clemency once he had served 25 years, as though the door might one day open for him. The detail that has followed Nikolaev ever since is not really about him at all. It is about the neighbors, ordinary people who accepted a gift of meat from a man they knew, cooked it, and served it to their families, never suspecting what they were eating until long afterward. That single fact is why his name still appears on lists of the country's most infamous cases, despite a count of only 2, far below many of the men he shares a prison with. He has never seemed to grasp the scale of the horror in it. In the interviews he gave, he circled back again and again to the unfairness of his sentence, rather than the nature of his crimes. A man arguing over arithmetic while the rest of the country looked on in disbelief. His prison file, those few blunt lines, is in its way a complete portrait. Escape risk, attack risk, cannibal, alcoholic, unbalanced. It is the kind of summary that leaves no room for the man to be anything else. And inside Black Dolphin, there is no reason to offer him one. He fills his days the way every life prisoner there does, on a schedule that begins before dawn and ends beneath lights that never go out. In a cell he will not leave. As of today, Vladimir Nikolaev remains at Black Dolphin, still listed among Russia's most notorious cannibals despite a count of 2. Proof that infamy is not always a matter of numbers. Nikolaev at least admitted, in his own blunt way, what had driven him. The pair whose story comes next wrapped their crimes in something far grander than hunger. Vladimir Guryanov, a man who left a religious group and came to believe he was the last heir of an ancient royal line, acting on a mission from a voice only he could hear. Alongside an older woman he called mother, Vladimir Guryanov spent 8 months carrying out that mission across a Russian city. Investigators first believed there were 5 victims. By the time the pair had finished confessing, the number had grown to 13. Vladimir Guryanov was born on March 27, 1964, in Saransk, in the Mordovia region. A former member of a religious community, he left it and reinvented himself as a self-declared prince, the last of an old dynasty, appointed by a higher voice to cleanse the world of sin. He drew in an accomplice, a woman 2 years his elder, whom he addressed as mother and who called him her son, the prince. Together, they built a shared delusion that would leave a trail of bodies across the city of Nizhny Novgorod. From late December of 2007 through August of 2008, the pair carried out a series that eventually accounted for 13 lives, along with 4 further attempts, 10 sexual assaults, and 11 armed robberies. Their first targets were fortune tellers and psychics, found through advertisements in the newspaper and chosen, in their telling, as sinners who deserved punishment. Later, they turned on victims with no connection to that logic at all. 3 of the bodies were buried in shallow graves and simply listed as missing, which is why investigators at first believed the case involved only 5 people. It was the pair themselves who, after their arrest, led police to the graves and pushed the count all the way to 13. What is a jury supposed to do with 2 people who insist they were only following the orders of God? The pair was arrested on September 3, 2008, in a supermarket in Nizhny Novgorod, lured into a back office by a security guard who invented a story about stolen chewing gum to separate them from the crowd. At trial, the jury returned a verdict of guilty without leniency on January 19, 2010, and on February 12, the sentences came down. Guryanov received life in a special regime colony. His accomplice received 19 years and 6 months in a general regime colony, and would die in custody in April of 2023. Guryanov confessed that they had punished sinners at the command of a voice from above. The prosecutor rejected all of it, telling the court that the religious talk was simply a chosen line of defense, and that in truth the crimes were committed for money. The victims robbed and their belongings sold off. One investigator noted that the pair recounted their crimes in the same flat, even voices they had used while committing them, which he called evidence of a rare and cold cynicism, only the second such case in his long experience. The relationship at the heart of the case was as strange as the crimes themselves. He was the prince, she was the mother, and between them they had built a private world complete enough that they narrated their own confessions in the same untroubled tone they must have used while committing the acts. That flatness, one investigator said, was almost unheard of, a coldness he had encountered only once before in many years of the work. The pair might have gone on longer had a supermarket security guard not recognized them and improvised a way to separate them from the crowd, inventing a petty accusation to draw them, armed as they were, into a back room where they could be held. It was an ordinary man's quick thinking, not a grand investigation, that finally ended an 8-month spree the police had badly underestimated. Guryanov was sent to Black Dolphin, where journalists who visited a few years later found a man wholly unmoved by any of it. He told them he had no desire to start his life over. As of today, he remains there, serving a life term with no prospect of release, still convinced, by every account, of the divine story he told at trial. The woman who called him her son did not share his cell or even his colony, but she shared his fate in the end. Sentenced to nearly 20 years in a general regime facility, she died in custody in the spring of 2023. The private world the two of them had built dissolving quietly with her. Guryanov, for his part, has given no sign of letting go of the story that put them both away. Still the prince. Still awaiting a coronation that will never come. Guryanov's pair found some of their victims in the classified pages of a newspaper. The last man in this story built his entire method around those same pages. Viktor Bolkovsky. He described himself, in a personal advertisement, as a professional maniac, and somehow the women who answered never saw the warning for what it was. Viktor Bolkovsky posed as a wealthy businessman and a famous television director, arranging first meetings in the homes of women he had never met. For 3 of them, that first meeting was the last. And the case that finally exposed him turned on a survivor who was never meant to live to speak. Viktor Bolkovsky was born in 1959 in the Kemerovo region of Siberia, according to the most authoritative accounts, though some place his birth in the city of Chita. A serious head injury in early childhood was followed, over the years, by disturbed behavior and a life that drifted off course after his parents divorced. By adulthood, he had become a predator with a patient and deliberate method, one built entirely on the trust of strangers. Bolkovsky was convicted of taking 4 lives across nearly 2 decades. The first was his own wife in 1980, a death that went unanswered for years. The other 3 came at the end of the 90s, in the cities of Kemerovo and Chita. 3 of the 4 women were found through newspaper dating and acquaintance advertisements, where he presented himself as rich and important, arranged to meet at the woman's home, and then robbed and took the life of his host. His crimes grew crueler as they went. In November of 1999, he arrived at the home of a woman who quickly realized he was nothing like the man he had advertised. He took her life, and when her young daughter returned home afterward, he subjected the girl to a prolonged ordeal. She survived. When she was able, she escaped and reached the police, and it was her account that brought his crimes to light and led directly to his arrest. How many more would there have been if that one survivor had not found her way out? On February 7, 2001, the Chita Regional Court sentenced Bolkovsky to life. His property was confiscated, and well over 100,000 rubles were awarded to the families of his victims. A psychiatric examination at the Serbsky Institute diagnosed him with a severe disorder, and he was sent to Black Dolphin. The young survivor's testimony had been central to the case, an act of courage that closed the door on a man who had counted on his victims never being able to speak. Everything he had built depended on that silence, and in the end, a single voice was enough to undo it. His entire method was an act of performance. He would answer an advertisement, or place one of his own, and arrive at a stranger's door dressed as the successful, important man he claimed to be. By the time the woman across the table understood that none of it was real, it was already too late. 3 lives ended that way, in the space of a first meeting, and a 4th, his own wife, had ended years earlier in a case that stayed quiet for a long time. He had counted every time on the same thing, that the person who saw through him would not live to tell anyone. It was the one occasion that assumption failed him that brought it all down. The examination that followed his conviction put a clinical name to what the advertisements had only hinted at: a deep and dangerous disorder that the court treated as a reason to remove him from society for good rather than as any kind of excuse. He was found responsible for every one of the lives he took. He was sent to the one prison in Russia built on the premise that certain people never stop being a danger, and nothing in the years since has suggested the court read him wrong. Now in his mid-60s, Bolkhovsky has spent roughly 25 years behind those walls. In 2025, he reportedly applied 3 separate times for parole or appeal, having served enough of his term to make the request. Each application was rejected without so much as a hearing. As of today, Viktor Bolkhovsky remains at Black Dolphin, where the men held on life terms are told, in effect, that the door will never open, and where, so far, it never has. 9 men, one prison on the edge of the Kazakh steppe, built on a single idea that certain sentences end only with the prisoner. Between them, they account for scores of lives, taken across decades and thousands of miles, from Siberian stairwells to a Kazan classroom to the corridors of a city hall. What they share now is an address, a cell, and a knock every 15 minutes that will follow each of them to the end. There are no work release programs here, no parole boards inclined to listen, and no path that bends back toward the free world. Only the same cell, the same schedule, and the same certainty. Some will die inside those walls, as one already has, and not one of them will ever walk back out. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.